Hello everyone, welcome back. Dr. John, am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you are. You are. Thank you.
Okay. So welcome to this session, the post-lunch session of the 7-day online international interdisciplinary workshop. And we have Dr. Maya John over here. She's from the University of Delhi, and she will be speaking today on, this is the title, From Gender in Class to Class in Gender, Towards an Understanding of a Missing Intersection. Dr. John, it's your floor, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, absolutely.
And visible as well, I hope?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, a warm thanks to the organizers of this international one-week workshop, and especially to my colleagues at the Women's Studies Center at Lady Brabourne College for inviting me for this interaction with scholars who are clearly researching, writing, and making forays in the interdisciplinary field of gender studies. So thank you for organizing this and inviting me. As evident in my broad title, my focus, is to push the participants to think very closely and critically about feminist theory approaches and some very well-known, well accepted, analytical tools in feminist theory, mainstream feminist theory. And I feel that by doing so, I'll be bringing, certain important questions to the floor, and I hope I leave you with enough food for thought. Indeed, my argument is that many concepts and many, analytical categories used in gender studies, of course, they're drawn from certain feminist, very concrete feminist claims and feminist readings of, the reality. I hope I'm loud enough, or do I need to speak louder? Is my volume okay?
It's perfect.
Okay, great. All right. So, of course, many concepts and analytical categories, and I'll be particularly focusing on one, that's intersectionality. They are used in a way in gender studies by, of course, engaging closely with certain feminist claims and feminist readings of, the reality. So, of course, I would say that I'm engaging with those theories, bringing them out here for the discussion, because I know their importance in gender studies and for feminist theorization. I'm also, drawing attention to these concepts and categories, analytical categories, because, I myself, am an activist, have been part of the women's movement, the trade union movement, and, due to one's own engagement with, movements on the ground with other feminists and one's own personal research, I hope to be able to give, a certain critical perspective for all of you to engage with. So I essentially seek to draw everyone's attention to what I would say, a certain lacuna, certain gaps in the very oft-used concepts, the very, well-known analytical tools in feminist theory, such as intersectionality. Now, let me begin first with let's say, a workable definition of feminism. What am I in this, session, or generally broadly, how does an activist, how do I define something like feminism? Um, you know, I actually would say that, the definition is not necessarily going to be one which you'll find, typically in textbooks. But nevertheless, I feel that, by defining feminism in this way, one will be able to capture certain unsettling realities of feminism, especially, in the present context, in the context of modern day capitalism. So let me say that, the dominant view on women's oppression, which one can identify as feminism, is representative in real terms of a blend of different contradictory ideas. It's packing together aims and interests that are different. Its targets and its tasks are also, dissimilar in many ways. And more often than not, feminism represents the embodiment of the discontent, the understandings of upper classes of women, more privileged women. A discontent, a reading, an understanding of, situations, which is then projected, as the general interest of all women. Now, we of course, uh, often talk in terms of waves of feminism. So having defined how, I'm thinking or explaining feminism, mainstream feminism in particular, let me then just, quickly identify that, we do work in the field of gender studies with the sense of, there have been waves of feminism over a period of time. The first phase, the second phase, the third phase, and so on and so forth. And, we're also aware of the fact that there are various strands of feminism. Now, it is the popular feminist approaches and the very mainstream assertions that have made their way into the public arena. These feminist approaches have become increasingly, popular and have held sway since the 1970s, onwards. Of course, there have been modifications, and then, there have been some changes. And I'm therefore going to focus on what I would identify as the mainstream approaches of feminism, mainstream feminism. Now, if we, closely, examine the second wave feminism, and its, successive trends after that, and especially if we look closely at and engage with our own present, contemporaneous conjuncture, and the kind of feminist claims, feminist theorization we see in present day, context, I would say that, we can actually begin to trace the trajectory of, mainstream feminism within a larger unfolding social transformation. And, there has been very interesting analysis of this. How do you see second wave feminism and subsequent, developments in feminism unfold within a larger context? What is that larger context? And here, of course, we have some fantastic work by, scholars like Nancy Fraser, who rightly, identifies that, you can see, contemporary mainstream feminism, evolve, alongside the very rapid consolidation of capitalism, or what, some would even identify as a new form of capitalism, that is, the post-Fordist, transnational, neoliberal capitalism. Now, notably, such arguments are about, how this new form of capitalism, or what many identify as neoliberal capitalism, and the co-option of feminism. So these kind of arguments that we see reflected in the work of people like Nancy Fraser and others, they're drawing our attention to an important aspect, an important, reality. They're highlighting that the problem with contemporaneous, that's present day mainstream feminism, is, it's this feminism's recognition focused agenda, without, understanding how the the political economy has changed. And thus, how this mainstream feminism is correspondingly sidelining the question of redistribution and the need to fight capitalism. So this, now very predominant form of feminism, mainstream liberal feminism, is what, Nancy Fraser, identifies as the cunning of history. That's basically the triumph not of womankind, not of all women, but of neoliberal capitalism, uh, wherein the majority of women remain trapped within exploitative class relations, concentrated in the lowest rungs of the labor market, trapped in unhappy, violent marriages, oppressive family structure and community structures, and so on. Meanwhile, a minuscule minority of more privileged women, break the glass ceiling. Now, in this way, what Nancy Fraser and many other critical, scholarship have pointed out is the need, therefore, to bring back, to return to the essence, the core of the earlier 20th century feminism. So that's before the second wave feminism, wherein the struggles were not limited, merely to transforming culture and mindsets, so as to create like this kind of more sanitized space, more sanitized, culture for upward mobile women to live, work, and prosper without of course changing institutions and without changing larger structures. So, rather, what a lot of the critical scholarship has been arguing is that rather it is about the need of the hour is about pushing forth with, changes that the earlier 20th century proletarian women's movement, working class women's movement had, committedly fought for, and which is, I mean, I don't have time to go into so much depth, but, the kind of, trust in the women's movement that we saw earlier in the 20th century, epitomized in the kind of politics and hard work and organizational, commitments of women leaders, theoreticians like Alexandria Kollontai, Clara Zetkin, and many others across the world. So, I would say in other words, it is really crucial for us, to distinguish between bourgeois mainstream liberal feminism as, something distinct from proletarian women's issues and concerns. And of course, we are talking about, the mainstream liberal feminism being distinct in terms of its claims, its understanding, its politics, from the concerns and realities of the larger majority of women. And I say proletarian women, laboring women, that is actually the much larger section of women whose issues and concerns are peripheralized to a large extent, and which actually, if we see this, this gap, if we see actually this distinction between what mainstream feminism stands for and pushes for, and of course what proletarian women or the larger majority of laboring women's concerns are, then it actually helps us, assess and judge the agenda and the direction of feminism as it has evolved and how it continues to evolve. Therefore, I would say that, my appeal today through this presentation is exactly this, the need to bring back the general interest of the majority of women. That is, laboring women, that is working class women, the most oppressed and vulnerable women, into bringing their issues into the center stage of emancipatory politics and into our analytical frames. Now, I argue this because, of course, as as we look at the reality around us, this is a fact. As we move further down, in the socioeconomic hierarchy, in the given socioeconomic order of the day, there is a reinforcement. There is a reinforcement of oppression uh, um, uh, along the axes of caste, along the axis of region, community, etc. Um, um, a reinforcement which shows that there's greater exploitation along the lines of caste, region, and community when you go lower down, in terms of class positions. So to explain, this particular point, let me just quickly, draw attention to the fact that, perhaps you can understand this process in terms of how, in the 20th century, the job market opened up in certain ways to women, and we found that women began to gradually gain access to certain kinds of higher rung jobs, and it's essentially the mainstream feminism is a baby of that, a product of that moment. So this is relatively privileged women who are making forays in higher education, in higher paid jobs, and they are, of course, fighting certain kinds of battles in their workplaces, etc. And this feminism of this otherwise small section of women, a minority, um, evolved in a way that it increasingly, failed to address the issues, the concerns of the majority of women, of laboring women. And why do I say this? Why do I keep emphasizing this? Now let us think in terms of certain concrete examples. Certain kind of elaborations might help. So let's take the deeply contested issue that was actually very, very hotly debated, produced some very interesting debates in the women's movement, especially in the West. And this is, of course, the issue of domestic work. Um, and, ironically, if we look at our own context here in India, the hotly debated domestic work question actually in many ways is missing. It's missing from Indian feminist discourses, and it remains largely under theorized. And this is, why is this again, this lacuna there? Why is this very important domain of work involving women and children's labor largely under theorized? I say this because most of feminists in our country, in India, have been and continue to be from the more privileged classes, more privileged backgrounds. And interestingly, even if we have a vocal, articulate feminists who are coming from historically discriminated caste groups or minority communities or undeveloped regions, the privileged class position of such feminists literally, ensures that, they have access to the cheap substitute for quote unquote their own domestic work. And here, of course, I'm referring to the domestic worker, the quote unquote maid, who's often, very often, from their poor, the domestic worker is very often a poorer sister coming from the same community, region, or caste group, etc. So what am I getting at? Expectedly, what I'm trying to say is that, we have never actually seen the domestic labor debate unfold here in India in any significant way. And this, represents in many ways an epistemological block. a hurdle in mainstream feminist analysis of this very important domain of work. Now, interestingly, it's not just India. Increasingly, even in the West, this question of, domestic work has increasingly, and prematurely dissolved. And it has been, relegated to the margins. And this is again because historically speaking, when you contextualize, larger developments, then of course with the growing access, of uh, people in the West to cheap, paid domestic workers migrating from South Asia, Philippines, Latin America. So access to this migrant, cheap labor, of course, has also created, that scope for a dilution, a relegating to the margins of this interesting and important debate on what to do with domestic work. Now, of course, there has been um, an interesting body of work by feminists, both in India and abroad, on paid domestic work. So I'm not oblivious of the kind of research that has been done on this field. And there's, of course, a lot of interesting assertions, theorizing of, how crucial this domain of work is for, subsidizing, social reproduction for capitalism. There's also work on, in the field of, gender studies, labor studies, on the need for legal reforms to regulate, the paid domestic work industry. But a lot of this theorizing, a lot of this, thinking through is without actually, seeing the need or understanding the need for transforming the labor process itself, the labor process involving the employer and the domestic worker. So just, to elaborate further, for example, where is there any critique, even in the existing theorizing on this question of domestic work, where is there any critique of, the 24-hour slavery performed by full-time, that's 24 into 7 domestic workers? And this particular form of paid domestic work is very entrenched in India and in certain other parts of the world itself. Now, my question would be here that, in the case of a full-time 24 into 7 domestic worker, paid domestic worker, labor time, which is the most crucial characteristic that defines work and the worker, is not even quantifiable. It's not even measurable. So, many such, questions arise, and particularly another important question is that why has this domain of work, that is domestic work, why haven't we seen its municipalization or greater socialization of this domain of work, whereas other very similar kinds of, drudgerous work, manual work such as sanitation work, historically speaking, came to be municipalized. For example, cleaning of streets, public places, etc., came to be, in the colonial period in our country, and more so post 1947, came to be organized around the municipality. But why did we see certain domains or work of domestic work, for example, not being touched by that larger unfolding process? And the question, when I'm raising this question of why, and more importantly, why we don't have a theorization of domestic work not being municipalized or its greater socialization not happening, I raise this question so that it helps us, think through, as I keep saying, certain, epistemological blocks, in, a larger reading of how the feminist, how the feminist movement is engaging with certain questions. It should also, help us understand how important it is to place ourselves, the question of positionality, within theory, right? So where you are coming from is also determining how you know what you know what you're seeing and what you're not seeing. So let me, having raised this, move on to a few more, questions, a few more, issues that will help us unpack this question of the epistemological hurdles, the blocks in mainstream feminism and its theorization. Um, Now, I would say this brings us, essentially to what I call, you know, an important set of questions on the issue of, uh, as I just said, representation in theory. What position are you coming from? From what position are you arguing and seeing things or not seeing things? Now, evidently, different typologies of women are becoming part of, the larger exercise of feminist theorization, including feminist theorization in the academia. Needless to say, of course, there is a large amount of theorizing that happens outside, academia, outside, university spaces or the world of publication. But just for now, let's focus on the formal world of academia. Um, and here I'd say that, uh, um, essentially we are seeing, different typologies of women, Dalit women, tribal women, women from religious minorities, persons of alternative sexualities, and so on, assert their positions in theory. But what remains unrepresented is the laboring poor. In general, the laboring poor. And within all these categories, that means within the category of Dalit women, tribal women, and so on, then the laboring woman, the working class woman, the proletarian woman in particular, remains unrepresented. Now, in other words, who does the theory and for whom is a very important question, I think, as we are looking at how to position our own work within the field of gender studies. I think that recognition, if you keep in mind and realize its importance, I think will be very crucial to the way in which you, develop your own contributions and interventions in the field of gender studies. So let me say that, an epistemological hurdle, that nurtured by, prevailing feminism, mainstream feminism, I believe is, most evident in the ways in which, issues of equality have been thought through, have been, theorized. And also, we see certain epistemological hurdles, certain blocks in, mainstream feminism, also reflected in its deployment, mainstream feminism's deployment of concepts like intersectionality. So let me take the first example, that is, how have issues of equality, gender equality, been envisaged and thought through by, mainstream feminism. Now, you know, what is meant by gender, equality? Um, in, the mainstream liberal interpretation, the idea that in the end, women are individuals, and they should, just like men, have the opportunity and the chance to go as far as their talent, their merit will, take them as individuals, is a very, like, basic essence of such kind of liberal interpretation and emphasis. But this is, again, a very class-specific articulation, a very class-specific ideal. What it really means is that, women who think like this within this kind of, liberal feminist interpretation of, opportunity, having rights, what it actually means is that they want to be equal to the men of their own class. So liberal meritocracy in many ways, as an interpretation of equality, has brought very few gains. And those gains are also, largely for a small minority of women, privileged women. while the overwhelming majority, fail to crack any glass ceiling. They continue to be stuck in the basement. They are cleaning up and sweeping up the broken pieces of glass. Now, less directly affected by class stratification, women from the more privileged classes are, of course, more inclined to perceive, to understand gender inequalities as a set of behaviors and a mentality that more or less has, an independent and autonomous capacity to breed, to nurture a system of unequal gender relations, to breed oppression. Um, Now, unlike their working class, proletarian laboring sisters or counterparts who are living an everyday reality of pauperization, of growing economic disparity, women from the more privileged, classes are naturally less likely, less prone to comprehend, to organize against the material basis on which women's oppression actually stands. Now, given the tendency towards delinking, gender inequality in this way from, the wider structuring realities like class, it is not it is not surprising to find, mainstream feminist theory very often, reinforce class sanitized, abstract concepts like, male power, or this, always present patriarchal desire to put women in their place when seeking to explain something like, the pervasive, sexual violence in contemporary society. And typically, holding on to this kind of, approach, mainstream feminist theory, in fact, downplays the fact that sexual violence cannot ultimately be eradicated as long as deep rooted class, divisions and other inequalities exist in society. So essentially by locking the problem of, something like sexual violence, this problem of sexual violence to the question of merely gender inequality or male-female inequality, many feminists, actually, and many feminist organizations actually slide into unnecessarily and incorrectly, individualizing culpability. That is, there's a tendency for them to project perpetrators of sexual violence as mere aggressors and not as products of a wider social problem, products of that society. So as a consequence, there has been in many ways an untoward evasion of class inequalities which breed sexism and thereby create the possibilities for rape. And this avoidance, this evasion is most evident in feminist perspectives on sexual violence, which tend to, on one hand, which tend to attribute victimhood, a woman becoming a victim or a survivor of sexual violence, to, the capitalist system, and attributing therefore vulnerability to the way the capitalist system works. But culpability of men or the rapists is, perceived as a separate coexisting, a product of a separate coexisting system, that's the patriarchal system. So there's this very, awkward deployment or use of the now outmoded dual systems theory, that patriarchy is a separate system and capitalism or is a separate system. Now, I would say that, the second important concern here is that, there is in this process, where mainstream feminism is not, seeing the dimensions or the ways in which class inequality complicates the picture, I would say that, that ignoring of prevailing class stratification in society and how that fuels gender-based oppression, gender-based violence, can be understood, in certain ways in which they are assuming things. And please here allow me to quickly, just for a few seconds, present my screen. And do let me know if you can see it. Is my screen visible?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great, great, great. So it's just this one slide I wanted to show you, is that, there is, when you're thinking about, gender inequality, and you're in the mainstream feminist, way, asserting that, what we want is that, women become equal to men, you have to push that question a little further and, see whether that kind of format of feminism is actually sensitive to the fact that, are we pushing for, are we then saying that what we want is working class men becoming equal to the more privileged middle class woman? Are we saying that capitalist men can become equal to working class women? I mean, it's actually the other way around. Working class women become equal to capitalist men, or that the capitalist man, is equal to and can become equal to the middle class woman. So obviously, if you just look at this, this little equation, this graphic description of where, and how, let's say, how misplaced a lot of the assertions of equality being the solution in terms of just gender equality being the solution, can become deeply, uh, deeply problematic. I hope, I think I've stopped sharing my screen now. It's just distracting. So I would say that what is evident from those little equations that I showed is just how, problematic, how fallacious it is to assume that equality simply between men and women of the same class, which is actually what a lot of mainstream feminists end up arguing for, given the way they're positioned, in the socioeconomic order and the way they're doing their politics. It actually amounts to, the fact that, they're just asking for an equality that's limited to men of their own class. But it's not about fighting for or preparing for an equality between men and women of different classes. And here I would just like to, use an interesting metaphor of a train journey to clinch this point. If we think in terms of the struggle against women's oppression as a train journey, I would say that, of course, like in a train journey, some passengers get off at earlier stations and some get off at the last station. I would say this is precisely the journey of, the struggle against, oppression of women in our society today. Some will get off earlier, and it is those women who are most exploited, most oppressed, coming from those sections of society, who would actually continue to the last station, given the concrete need for them to see through the larger complete transformations. Now here I'd like to just use the last few minutes that I have to talk through the example of one very important analytical category, concept which is used in feminist theorization, and that is intersectionality, the concept of intersectionality, which, has actually enabled, us to enlist different kinds of oppressed women. However, it is important to realize that together they do not constitute, these women that we enlist through, a deployment of intersectionality do not constitute a unitary category of women. They do not constitute having a similitude of interest. There is no equivalence in the experiences and in the interests of women across, the board. Now, although gender is imbricated in the matrix of power, gender inequality, is contingent on the class position to which women belong. Hence, although men have advantages over women of the same class, we cannot forget that women from privileged classes are far closer in material terms in socioeconomic terms, to men in their class than they are to their poorer working class, sisters or tribal women or Dalit women. The broadening and consolidating of the category of women in the way mainstream feminism deploys intersectionality, actually has meant that, literally upper class women are being placed on the same platform as, their domestic workers. That a woman CEO is equivalent, in her position to the female factory workers, she hires and fires at will. That Sonia Gandhi is equal to a tribal woman protesting against, land acquisition. Regrettably, therefore, mainstream feminist adherence and their use of intersectionality approach have, been omitting this very essential truth, this very essential fact when theorizing, women's oppression in terms of equivalence, that there is actually no such concrete equivalence, and that where your position, your class position actually determines what you're experiencing and how you're fighting it. So using this, approach, I would say, intersectionality has, of course, allowed feminists, to explain certain intra-categorical complexity. So intra-categorical complexity means that, within the category of women, acute differences stemming from the woman being from a particular caste or region. So of course, intersectionality as a concept has allowed, feminists to explain certain intra-category complexities, like acute differences of position within those clubbed together as women. But as a consequence, what we're seeing is the same concept, intersectionality, is allowing feminists to engage with the issue of class and other, social positioning by simply adding them to the list of victims and consolidating at the end of the day this unitary category of women. So in contrast to that kind of deployment of intersectionality, I think the more important category, which also helps us, recognize, draws our attention to, certain epistemological hurdles in mainstream feminism and its analysis, is, what I call the category of interlocking different positionalities. That is how one position is complicit in the exploitation and oppression of another. So I would say that, indeed, the complicity of various kinds exists along, the axes of community, caste, class, and so on, which, cautions us against assuming any kind of unitary womanhood. It is after all, what makes, for example, majority of caste Hindu women indifferent to the exploitation, for example, of Dalit women, as well as a large number of women from the majority community being apathetic to the betrayal that the struggling Bilkis Bano, has undergone, and so on. So let me return to the very useful example of an epistemological block or hurdle within our mainstream, feminism, so as to highlight the need for seeing not just the dimension of difference, that of course there is difference between this woman and that woman, but also seeing the contradictions and the complicity stemming from certain positions with respect to, that means contradictions with respect to the oppression of others within the category of women. Now, here again, it's, the winning of the right to work by middle class and other privileged women, for instance, we know has been accompanied by the employment of the paid domestic worker, the quote-unquote maid, who steps in as the cheap substitute for these more privileged women's, having to do domestic work. And this development, has of course culminated in brutal exploitation of working class women as domestic workers. And I work with domestic workers trade unions, and it's a harsh reality of everyday exploitation. I can go into it later if there's a question particularly with respect to that. But what I'd like to say is that, through this example of the madam and the maid, what I'd like to draw attention is to, gone is the analysis or recognition of the fact that what about the question of who attends to the drudgery of housework and care work associated with, the social reproduction in the home, in the hearth of the domestic worker. So she actually is working in upper class privileged homes, doing that, a woman's share of that woman's domestic work. And she's coming back and doing her own domestic work. So where have we resolved, the question of domestic work for such a large number of women in our country who continue to do this kind of work in their own homes? My last example, before I conclude, takes me to this, this very interesting, situation of, apart from the Madam Maid example, how we can see, even choice feminism or power feminism today, which, has very powerfully in very interesting ways critiqued, hyper masculinity. And true, such hyper masculinity needs to be critiqued. It needs to be fought back. It needs to be exposed. But the same, the same choice feminism, power feminism that critiques, hyper masculinity is an adherent of, hyper femme behavior and reproduction of what many of us call raunch culture. It valorizes that in the name of choice, in the name of power feminism. So you can't change certain things about how women's sexuality and beauty works. So play accordingly, play it up, right? And this is my choice, right? So we're familiar with these kind of assertions, and we've seen it as part of the movement. And, there's some interesting work here. Of course, I don't have time to go into it, but literally this kind of, expression of choice feminism, power feminism, which actually plays on hyperfemic behavior, has been very well theorized in work of people like Ariel Levy, who actually identifies a lot of this as female, female chauvinism, and it is, of course, coming from an elevated status and, greater financial gains of a section of women, so of course, there are these other ways also in which we can see the blind spots and the gaps in the way mainstream feminism is evolving, engaging with how oppression of women exists. My conclusion would be that, these are the main takeaway points, what I've been trying to build up the discussion around. Number one, mainstream feminism has stopped challenging, it stopped challenging the economic and political order of the day. And this is very well brought out in the work of Nancy Fraser. I would encourage, people to read it closely, her work. And in lieu of, finding, finding space for themselves within the, constellation of things, the given order, there's been that, there's been that lack of challenging, taking on the system, the economic and political order that exists. And this is something I appeal to all of you, needs to be recognized. Possibly this needs to be highlighted and critiqued more in our own work as we move forward. My second point is that as a concept which is, deployed a lot by mainstream feminist theory, that's the concept of intersectionality, per se does not resolve the deadlock that liberal mainstream feminism finds itself in. It is not enough for our theory in politics to simply explain or talk in terms of this woman has heightened oppression, she's more, oppressed. So it's not just recognizing in an additive vein that one woman is more exploited or oppressed than another, and at the same time downplaying, not recognizing, not seeing that there's actually an interlocking of oppression, that there is an element of complicity where one section of women is actually concretely involved in the oppression and exploitation of another section of less privileged women. I'd say the brand of mainstream feminism is going to be devastating for the women's movement and also for feminist analysis going forward if these epistemological blocks are not called out. So thank you. I'll end with this and take any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. John, for that very invigorating presentation. It was a comprehensive discussion of feminist perspectives and the feminist readings of reality. You have shown the limitations of mainstream feminism, the gap between bourgeois mainstream liberal feminists and the proletarian women's issues, and of course the need to bring together general issues of the majority of women. Thank you so much. It was indeed an enlightening and a very, very enriching presentation. I invite questions or comments now. Yes, Anuradha Mazumdar says, a brilliant lecture, Professor Maya John, thoroughly edifying and engaging. Malini Mukherjee thanks you for the wonderful presentation. Any questions, please, or comments, of course?
May I say something instead of typing? And this
Yes,
is
yes.
Anuradha Majumdar from Prafulla Chandra College. Dr. John, I'm really, I don't have enough words to express, how moving I found your lecture, especially at the level of concepts, I mean, I have been aware to some extent of this, problem of the class and gender intersectionality, but you have concretized the problems to my what shall I say, great admiration. But it may be a little different from your main points of arguments, but I find a certain level of similarity. I am currently researching on women's Holocaust memoirs, and especially these belated memoirs that started coming out in large numbers from say the 1990s to down to the 2020s and something. And your lecture made me think about some of the points of differences that I have noticed in among the authors. I mean, of course, there is no unitary womanhood and therefore no universal category of concern that is applicable to all of these memoirists. But one very interesting difference that becomes more interesting in the light of your present lecture is that, if we talk of, let's say, a woman like Dr. Edith Eger, she is the author of this very famous, rather we should call it a bestseller called The Choice. And she is, of course, narrating the trauma related to the Holocaust. She was, of course, incarcerated at a very young age and, experienced a near-death situation and then was finally liberated. But she went on to become a clinical psychologist, and she's 94 or 5 years old, still practicing in the US. But if you notice, some of the points she makes in her memoirs, it's about, how to deal with what she calls the trauma prison and how to come out of it. And also, even though she doesn't directly propagate the idea of forgiving the perpetrators, there is an element of coming to terms with this attempt to come to terms with the trauma, where some forgiveness may be necessary. But if we take the example of another of the memoirists who had been, a woman from a practically unlettered farmer's family, she has also written a memoir. It's by Sarah Leibowitz. And in her memoir, though, we find that there is not a trace of forgiveness for what was done to her and to her family. So, these very radically different responses to the same, let's say, set of horrors that women experienced as a category, as a gender category in the Nazi camps, is really, really struck me. And perhaps your theorization today, your concrete examples today would make me rethink about these from a class perspective. The fact that the former memorist came from a rather privileged, educated, cultured Polish family, and the fact that the other woman, Sarah Leibowitz, though both Jewish, came of an unlettered peasant family, perhaps their reactions to the same set of horrors was different because of this, this intersection of their class positions. Would you say that, or did I really make my point?
Yes, I do see a resonance in what you have, been pointing out when looking at this particular literature yourself, and what I have been asserting, in my own work and what I shared with you today. Yes, there is a resonance. You see, just looking at the way you were able to trace in this, in this little time, the varied, ways in which, these women are expressing, themselves, what they're going through. Of course, very, very clearly you see that
Yes,
division, that
yes, yes,
distinction.
yes.
We cannot leave that division, that difference under theorized. We need to take it on and explain it. And that's precisely what I'm saying. I mean, when we look at, certain historical moments, such as, the struggle against colonialism, so anti-colonial struggle, for example, in India and other parts of the world. Very lucidly, theory has developed along the lines of the comprador. So we talk about always a comprador compromise section that, negotiated with and compromised with the colonial power, right?
Yes, yes.
And why don't we just take that concept and refine it to explain comprador women, and
Mm-hmm.
comprador, women who take certain kinds of positions, and that is very important for us to identify. And I think in the field of literature, because you seem to be a person working in the field of literature, English literature, I would like to draw attention to someone, a stalwart of, feminism, Virginia Woolf.
Yes,
You know,
yes, of course, of
and
course.
when Virginia Woolf, interestingly, is penning Room of One's Own, interestingly, her own six domestic workers were complaining that six of them had to share a room.
Hmm.
So I'm just saying that, uh, 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 the point is, what I'm asserting is, that we have to, look for these cleavages, these distinctions, and we have to explain where it's coming from. That has
Yes,
to be part of our theorizing, of our tracing of history, etc. And I would say that, it's not just about when we work with these concepts and we develop these concepts of comprador, comprador positions, comprador women. We're actually therefore pointing out or highlighting that, it's not just finding your place, in the system, but it's about seeing how systems are creating entrenched inequality, how the systems are in transit. They need to be changed, they can be changed, and that is actually going to help what we call real emancipatory politics, where the condition of majority, in this case majority women, will actually change. And I think that's the important part, which I would emphasize needs to be brought in more into our analysis and our theory. With respect to the questions which are coming, in the chat box, to female chauvinism, I would say that, uh, in terms of how do we see female chauvinism working today, power feminism working today, and what it's doing to the larger women's movement, it's literally this, that it's brought us to this moment where, we are no longer seeing a critique, a formidable everyday critique in circulation of beauty itself. just look around us today in the women's movement. We're so defensively holding on to this thing ki we can, wear whatever we want to wear. We can, do whatever we want to do. It's our choice has become such a big slogan now that everybody wants to be seen defending it rather than actually building a politics and an understanding that those are notions of beauty of female sexuality that are themselves enslaving. And choice is manufactured, choice is structured. So we have to critique objectification of women, which power feminism, choice feminism is not allowing. Now the point is we don't just have to critique objectification of women, commodification of women. We have to critique self-objectification of women. And I think that is where our battle lies. I've been asked to identify, how do we deal with female chauvinism and its challenges to the feminist movement. It's by more consciously, more vocally critiquing self-objectification that is happening, and hence the culture of hyperfemic behavior, etc. Mona Lisa's question on, do you think consciousness raising across class lines by women activists and women academics can help in addressing this gap? I think first and foremost, as I've been saying, in terms of, if we're looking just at the academia, it means rethinking the way we are deploying many mainstream concepts and theories like intersectionality, So at least let's begin where we are immediately located, which is our own research, our own academic spaces, and let us factor in how how important it is to bring in the class dimension when we're looking at gender oppression, when we're looking at other inequalities pervading in society, and in terms of how to bring in the question of class outside the academia. I would say that it is about, raising the consciousness is important, but ultimately, we have to, fight the condition of complicity, So this would mean that, even when we are organizing, where do we build our organizations? Where do we prioritize our movements? Are we organizing the most exploited section of women workers? Are we organizing, the most oppressed women? And where are our women's organizations, our movements stemming from? Are we able to do that kind of relocating, reprioritizing? Because that is ultimately that's going to build the force. It's going to build the base for us to change the structure, change the institutions, change the economy, the order of the day. Otherwise, we will not be able to do anything and subvert the given system.
Thank you, Dr. Joan, once more for that wonderfully enlightening lecture. We do hope to have you again with us sometime in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing this and for the questions. I have shared 2-3 readings, but if anybody wants anything else, please contact the organizers and I will get back with suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.